Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Long Game Podcast with myself, Ben Scallon, and Jason Osborne. We are going to be discussing a plethora of subjects today. We're going to be talking about Helen McEntee's fear that Euroscepticism might be bubbling up in Ireland, God forbid. We're going to be talking about the rental sector in Ireland and the ludicrous prices. Whenever you go on daft.ie, you'd almost have a heart attack at some of the prices that we're seeing and what that says about society more broadly. We're going to be talking about a Fianna Fáil TD's suggestion that the state shouldn't do business with companies whose CEOs hold, quote, anti-government views. Apparently that's a disqualifying criterion now if you want to try and do business with the state, if you're a tech company, for example. And we're going to be talking about movies that have come out recently and how brutal and overrated they are on a more cultural note. And I think Jason will have some interesting takes on that as a
I will, and I would just say, in case people at the top think that one's random, it's related to the Oscars announcement last week, which very much plays into what Ben said, which I think is that mediocrity has been rewarded. And I also think the politics of movies last year were particularly interesting, and that's why it's worth talking about.
Yeah, I think that'll be an interesting one, which I look forward to. But with that said, we'll kick off with our first topic, which is Helen McEntee, the Foreign Affairs Minister, who was speaking last week. And you wrote an article on this, which was quite widely read. I'm wondering if you want to talk us through Miss McEntee's remarks as they came out of her mouth before we issue our thoughts on that.
Yeah, so maybe we won't go through the whole speech because it was very lengthy. I mean, the reason I thought it was worth, I don't write up everything Helen McEntee says, but I thought the reason it was worth writing up was because it was sort of her first major policy speech during her time in the dual roles of Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade and Defence, those two separate roles, obviously. And I'd come across that she was going to be giving this speech, so I just had a look at it. And the most notable line for me, the one that I chose to center the piece on, was she expressed her concern about, quote, a rising level of Euroscepticism in our country. The reason she focused on this is because obviously in the second half of this year, Ireland is assuming the EU presidency, and therefore it'll have quite some say in terms of setting the agenda for the countries of Europe to consider. So she wanted to use her speech to sort of focus on essentially the pros of Europe, to put it that way. So she said she was concerned by a rising level of Euroscepticism in her country, and I'll quote here, it puts forward the seductive populist claim that our problems, and like everybody else we have our problems, do not lie in our own hands. They must be the fault of somebody else, and the EU or Brussels is a convenient somebody. She went on to say that a national conversation on Europe is required because, quote, we cannot cede the stage to these voices. And she
I'm sorry to interrupt you already, and maybe this is unfair. I have no direct evidence that what I'm about to say is true, but it just sounds right to me that I don't think she wrote this speech. It just doesn't. I know all politicians have speeches written for them, and that's completely normal. Politicians you like, politicians you dislike. It's very normal that they don't have time to sit around writing speeches on everything they talk about. But I usually the speechwriter will try to do it in your kind of style and cadence, and it's supposed to sound seamless. Like a Simon Harris speech generally sounds like something that he would say, whereas I just do not get Helen McEntee vibes from this. I don't know. Maybe I'm being unfair to her, and maybe she labored over it for hours. But
there's definitely something to that. I mean, you know, lest we be accused of straying into the territory of conspiracy that Helen McEntee isn't writing her own speeches. I mean, politicians obviously have speech writers and things like that. But it's just, I agree. Even when I was writing it, I thought this didn't sound like Helen McEntee normally sounds. But anyway.
And again, that's not a criticism per se. Like Donald Trump uses speechwriters. Almost every politician in the world uses speechwriters. It's normal.
Well, Donald Trump is this is a complete I'm going to say, at the risk of annoying some of our viewers, I had the misfortune of listening to his Davos speech last week while it was taking place. It was about an hour long, maybe slightly over an hour. And I think that I clearly think Donald Trump's an extraordinarily, contrary to, you know, mainstream opinion, I do think he's extraordinarily clever. I don't think you get to where he is without being extraordinarily clever and having the effect that he's had without being very clever. I think he's very funny as well. But one thing that he's very much, in my opinion, not that I've done these things, but just comparing him to other politicians, he's really bad at giving speeches. He rambles, he repeats, he gets things wrong in the speeches. It's not to say, obviously, that other politicians don't get things wrong, but it was genuinely the most painful political speech I've listened to in a good long while. So that's just a tangent to potentially annoy a lot of people. But to get back to Helen McEntee, who we were obviously concerning ourselves with, despite all of those things she said that this does not mean that the conversation, the national conversation on Europe, that is, should, quote, only be about praising the EU. I am a dedicated European, but this does not mean that criticism of Europe is unjustified. Criticism is absolutely necessary, she said. She obviously spoke on a load of other things in this speech. She referenced Greenland. She spoke about the sort of, what were they, the three pillars of values, security, and competitiveness that Europe needs to be focusing on at the moment. But we're mainly interested in those Euroscepticism comments that indeed you wrote a comment piece in reaction to this week, Ben.
Yeah, I just think that people like Helen McEntee have nobody to blame but themselves if there is an increase in Euroscepticism. And, I'm not a delusional person in the sense that I don't think there is a risk that Ireland is about to be taken over by a Eurosceptic political movement. Like, I am saying this as a Eurosceptic. I am extremely critical of the EU, and I have been for as long as I've been interested in politics. Like, I literally stood for a Eurosceptic political party. So that's me putting my bias out in front, just for full disclosure's sake. But with that said, all of the polling clearly indicates that the vast majority of Irish people do have a favourable opinion of the EU, and that's also backed up anecdotally when you just talk to people. If you just have any kind of conversation with your average Irish normie, most people are pretty fond of the EU. So
the vast majority of thinking people do about the EU is when they see a sign next to a motorway that says this project was funded by the EU, and that's about it.
Yeah, pretty much. And they also know that they don't like the people who don't like the EU. So they don't like Nigel Farage or, people like that. They'll have a negative opinion of the opposition. So they assume, well, the EU must be all right. But with that said, and of course, I also don't want to be, I don't want to trivialize it either, because there are valid reasons to support it as well. But anyway, with all of that said, I think the reason Irish politicians are to blame if there is a rise in Euroscepticism, or if they are detecting an uptick, is because Europe has been the scapegoat for every single situation in which Irish politicians find themselves in any kind of trouble with the public. For years, they constantly point to Brussels as the reason why they have to do things that are unpopular, why they can't do things that the public wants. They say, oh, well, look, that wouldn't... I mean, just to give practical examples that people will be familiar with, of course, we all know the international obligations line was flogged like a dead horse. They've stopped doing that. And I don't want to take full credit for that. I'm sure there's a variety of reasons, but I did a super cut where I cut together like 50 examples of Irish politicians talking about international obligations in the context of immigration. And very shortly after that video was released, I noticed they just stopped doing it because they realized that it was like embarrassing and that like people had caught on to the fact that this is just a talking point that they've media trained to death. But that the point of the international obligations line, what they were trying to convey with that was, we are obliged, we are forced by international rules due to bodies like the EU and the UN and so on to do what we're doing vis-a-vis immigration. It's not up to us. Don't be shouting at me. If you have a problem with this, take it up with these international treaties. It's out of our hands. That's effectively what they're saying. So you can't tell me that. And then when I get angry with the people you told me to get angry at, suddenly turn around and say, wow, why are you doing that? What is with this rise of Euroscepticism? And it goes way beyond...
They directed the mob over there, and when the mob goes over there and starts attacking this person, they're like, hey, leave him alone.
Yeah, literally. And it goes way beyond just immigration. When it comes to energy, there was a story from, I believe it was 2022, when energy prices were going crazy because this was the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and it was extremely difficult for Europe because we were so dependent on Russia for energy, and it was this big chaotic moment, turbulent moment for the global energy markets. We were having to ask the European Union for permission to keep open some of our domestic power stations longer than their scheduled closing dates because of climate targets and things. We also had to ask the EU, according to Irish politicians, for help with things like the. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank now. It was energy. Oh yeah, taxation, motor taxation. We had to ask them for the ability to lower that because people were suffering from that perspective. And of course, most recently, the Mercosur deal, which if farmers pull up to the Dáil and start shouting at Micheál Martin, he's going to say, well, look, we voted against it. We tried to stop it, but the European bodies passed it, and we were outvoted by other countries. So what do you want me to do about it? And, we tried our best to get concessions, but we've done all we can do. So at every turn, they blame Europe for the problems that we face as a country, sometimes correctly and sometimes incorrectly. Of course, people are going to eventually start taking you at your word and blaming Europe because that's what you told them to do. So the fact that they're surprised by this, I think, just shows how poorly thought out their strategies have been from a PR perspective for many years now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we were talking before we went on air about our respective positions on this. You were already stating your own, obviously, whereas I, at the risk of, as always, outing myself as a sort of lib by sentiment or something like this, I do kind of lament somewhat the ejection of idealism from politics, to put it that way. I feel like the 2010s in particular were an extraordinarily idealistic time at the expense of realism in many ways. And indeed, that the ideals that a lot of these politicians were striving for were not were unhealthy reforms, unhelpful reforms, essentially. But to make this more concrete in terms of what we're talking about, I do like the idea of the EU. I do see advantages and benefits to it. Indeed, there were very good people involved in the establishment of the EU, as we were also talking about. The difficulty
we're talking about Robert Schuman, who is on his way to becoming a Catholic saint, one of the founders of the EU, and like he's good. The Vatican are talking about canonizing him, and basically he envisaged it as a peace project whereby cooperation. Obviously, we'd come out of two major world wars that led to tens of millions of people being slaughtered, and so the idea was, if we have all the countries of Europe be interdependent on each other for trade, then they're much, especially with things like coal and steel that are necessary for war, then you're less likely to go to war with each other because you need each other. So it was designed to create peace in Europe, and it did that pretty successfully. And there's nothing wrong with that at that stage. So far, if that was what it was and that's what it remained, there'd be no issue. I think that's a beautiful concept.
Absolutely.
It worked very well.
At the risk of putting words in Mr. Schumann's mouth, I don't, or ascribing positions to him that he wouldn't ascribe to, I think that he wouldn't be particularly happy with a lot of the developments, say, of the European Union, particularly in relation to the European Commission and its sort of extensive, far-reaching powers. I don't think that was what he had in mind initially. Now, I'm not an expert on Robert Schuman and his vision, but I sort of feel comfortable assuming that to be the case, although people can correct me if I'm wrong, obviously. That said, as I said at the beginning, I am fond of the idea of the European Union. I mean, I think if you were to, say, remove the ideologues from the picture, you do have something decent and worthwhile. If you had a union in the better kind of diversity, which is, say, the diversity of the actual European member states as they are in their full sovereignty, I think that, if you had an EU of all of these countries where their sovereignty is fully respected, and it was only when, say, the only time it kind of cohered, I suppose, into a kind of fist, you might say, was when one of them was being, say, genuinely threatened. Say one of them was being sort of economically threatened in some regard, and so they could cohere into a bloc in order to sort of protect each other and things of that kind of nature. But that's obviously not where Europe is at. I think you increasingly see, as I say, the European Commission in particular acting in a kind of federal manner, which is obviously the criticism a lot of people have of the EU, which is that there's always this tension, particularly around the times of the European elections, that you have people saying, well, no one voted for Ursula von der Leyen or for the commissioners, whereas other people will say, yeah, well, you elect the democratic representatives who then sort of like ratify and work with all of these people. But it's like these are so many steps removed from your average person's experience that it may as well not matter. And I mean, it's also the case that obviously the government recommends commissioners, and they then go work for the commission, and the commission has a lot of power in terms of Europe and its agenda and its direction of travel. So it's very much morphed into a federal structure, which I think a lot of people take obviously understandable issue with. I think that some of the clear, because I, again, just to say to first time listeners, I live in Poland, and I think Poland, being one of the few countries in the EU that's really stuck its neck out and been very resistant over the past 15 years, is a very clear example of this. Like one that I was only reading about recently that I find really infuriating is Poland. So this was reported just last week. Poland prepares implementation of EU ruling on recognizing foreign same-sex marriages. So Poland, still being quite a traditional country, doesn't recognize same-sex marriage. You can't, two men, two women can't get married in Poland. And indeed, they didn't recognize same-sex marriages that were married abroad, as is Poland's sovereign right, in my opinion. But this couple, anyway, that tried to get their, if I'm remembering correctly, they tried to get their marriage recognized in Poland. It was two Polish men who'd gone abroad to get married, and then they came back and tried to get their marriage recognized. Naturally, they didn't, so they took it to the Court of Justice of the European Union, which ordered the country to recognize same-sex marriages conducted in other member states. And now Poland essentially has to. And so the ministry proposed a change to sort of civil registry documents, which would use the designator as first spouse and second spouse instead of the current man and woman. People might say, that's only a tiny thing, but it's like the EU shouldn't be able to do that. Poland and the Polish people should be able to decide for themselves what they want to recognize as marriage, and you shouldn't have these European institutions that come along and say, you're actually going to change your forms at the very least to recognize this form of marriage that your country doesn't recognize. And I think it's just there's more examples. I mean, one other one, as I say, just particularly on Poland, because I think it's such a there's so many examples you could use. You could use the fact that when the Tusk government came in back in 2025, the EU opened up COVID recovery funding that they had withheld from the previous nationalist conservative government because they believed them to be engaging in abuses of law. Whereas even supporters, even liberals in Poland, had a lot of hesitations about the way the Tusk government conducted itself when it came into power here. And they said it's conducting itself in the same way as the previous government, but just because these were to Brussels' liking, Brussels said, okay, you guys can have the money. So it is ideal. The EU structure, I'm ranting a bit here. I don't want to let you come in now, but it's ideologically riddled, and I fully understand why people want it all thrown out because they think it's sort of not salvageable. I'm being sort of slower and steadier by nature, reluctant to say that the whole thing is useless and there's no place for it. I would be more inclined to think that the sort of slow and steady work of reform ought to be done on it. And it will be slow and steady and a sort of long game in the same way that national renewal will be in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, in principle, I would agree with the idea. Like, I would not be opposed to the concept of the EU in principle as it was initially laid out. I don't have any problem with trade cooperation agreements between European countries, like-minded states cooperating with each other. All of that is totally grand. But I would be skeptical and highly dubious of the idea that it can be reformed at all, because the entire system, the European frame, like the institutions are designed to be unbelievably resistant to reform and to change, in the sense that if we were to elect, if 100% of the MEPs that Ireland elects were extremely Eurocritical people who wanted to go in there and, start knocking heads together and changing things in a radical way, I think we only have like around 1% of the total number of MEPs. I forget the exact number that Ireland has. It changed after Brexit, but we've maybe a dozen or so in and around that. And there's maybe 700 or so
something like
MEPs
that.
total in the European Parliament. So it kind of doesn't matter what wavelength we're on. The rest of the continent is deciding critical things for us. And as a small state, you're just going to get screwed over and steamrolled. You have no real influence in that regard. The Parliament doesn't even propose legislation. They aren't really a parliament. It's kind of a misnomer or stupid. It gives it like the veneer of democracy, but they're not a parliament in any sense that you traditionally mean a parliament. The commission proposes legislation. It goes to the parliament and they can propose amendments or they can vote stuff down, but they can't suggest stuff of their own volition. So the idea that you're going to get a European Commission that is stacked heavily enough in favor of people like ourselves to actually reform the entire institution in the way that it needs to be reformed, I just don't think that's realistic at all.
Well, no, I don't think it's realistic in the short term again, but I do also think that the cultural current clearly swung liberal in recent decades, and in exactly the same way. I don't think, and as I said, I don't think it's going to happen soon, but I do think that it's just human nature to be changeable, and at some point, I am reluctant to say things will swing more back to common sense, because that kind of implies that the only two positions you can occupy are liberal and conservative. That it's this kind of binary. Whereas, as we are all very much aware at this stage, there's a whole variety of opinions out there and a whole load of positions that could be adopted by a future European structure. But I just think that I agree with you. In the current form, it's doing a lot of damage, and it's obvious why whispers of Euroscepticism are rising amongst not insignificant numbers of the public, not just in Ireland but across the EU. But I do think that whether it's the sort of European project now or something in the future, the good idea is something to be bookmarked there. Obviously, like cooperation, a sort of.
I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but what if I throw a hypothetical devil's advocate perspective at you, and I'd like to hear your reaction or thoughts on this. Guy Verhofstadt a couple of years ago was talking about how Europe needs to become an empire. And immediately, if you are an ordinary person and you hear that, you almost have a heart attack. Like that, literally, I've got chills, and not in a good way, hearing that. Like that's literally making me break out in hives, the sound of that. But his argument was, he said, we're entering an era of history. And he said this years ago, before any of the Greenland stuff, before any of the Russia stuff, Russia and Ukraine. I mean, I think Crimea was going on, but before the most recent invasion. And he said, you've got empires that are forming and coalescing, big, great powers that are throwing their weight around on the world stage. China, Russia. I don't know if I'd call Russia a great power anymore, given everything that we've seen, but they seem pretty big, bigger than most countries. India to a certain extent, America. And so the only people, he was saying, in the new chapter of history that we're entering, the only states and regions that are going to have any influence at all are the ones that are big enough to throw their weight around. And no individual European country has that kind of pull on its own. And so by forming a kind of a European cohesive empire, was the word he used, we can then go toe-to-toe and go band for band, as it were, with the Americas and Chinas of the world. And so he said that was kind of a necessity if you want to avoid just getting strong-armed by the toughest guy on the block. And he would probably say, I haven't heard him say this, but I'm sure if he was here, he would say he's been vindicated by that with the Greenland stuff, with the Ukraine stuff, with this, that, and the other. I do not agree with Guy Verhofstadt, but I don't know. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that because it's not the dumbest thing I've ever heard. It's at least worth considering, you know?
Yeah, no, well, no, suffice I don't agree with something like that. I do think that, like, because obviously the whole idea of an empire sort of implies a sort of central power that can sort of direct its issuings outwards, which, funny enough, in some ways isn't that different from what we have at the moment anyway. I mean, you look at the Greenland proceedings, and obviously we're far away from that entry. We were far from that entering into a hot conflict, but certainly there was a real potential for that to enter a trade conflict. And that's the kind of thing that would have been extraordinarily damaging to Ireland, despite the fact that we had no direct stakes in it. And it's like, I'm sure if you had asked, you know, to be honest, I don't know what sort of answer you'd get if you ask the Irish public what sort of approach we ought to take on a topic like that. But I would like to think that we would say we ought to mind our own business on in terms of entering into a trade war with the United States over Greenland.
Well, let me push back on that again. Let me do another devil's advocate. Might a proponent or a supporter of the EU not say it is very much in the interest of states like Ireland that are incredibly weak and at the mercy of bigger countries that we don't allow a precedent that smaller countries like Denmark, which I believe the Denmark population is very similar to ours. They're a very small country. They're not influential, kind of like us in that regard. That we don't want to set the precedent that countries like that can be bullied. That it actually does pertain to us in the sense that we don't want to allow that to become normalized.
I think that's a very good point, and I would agree 99% of the time, but I think we find ourselves in the 1% of the time that I wouldn't have liked us to 1% of the situations I wouldn't like us to find ourselves in, which is where we're entirely dependent on American foreign direct investment. And so we have to be somewhat canny in terms of how we operate. God knows, I wish we were more sort of diversified. Maybe if we were going to have an open economy, it'd be better to be more diversified and not so dependent on this one power. But we're talking about entering into a trade conflict here with one country that has the potential to absolutely sink us in economic terms. So I agree that, if we're sort of talking about an idealized world where the EU is kind of operating in a more appropriate manner, if we're going to adopt that framework, absolutely, I do think there's something to be said for the countries sort of banding together and saying, okay, well, it's not a good precedent to set if we kind of just, leave Denmark out on its own to fend off the US. But that's not the situation we find ourselves in. And I think the situation we find ourselves in at the moment does require some sort of political savvy, even if it isn't ideal.
Yeah. At a certain point, practicalities do have to be considered. It's all well and good, and I do. I mean, the telling comment from Helen McEntee was that she's what did she say? She's a devoted European or a committed European,
something like that. Yeah, I can pull it up here. A dedicated European.
A dedicated European, like that kind of language gives me the creeps, and it really indicates to me that a lot of these people do view their loyalty to the European project as being the kind of a central part of their identity in a way that I do not think is healthy. I don't mind Ireland. I acknowledge and respect Ireland's place in European history. Irish monks played a huge role in Europe, and they helped us in many ways. And you know what I mean. Like I don't want to be some kind of isolationist nut job.
No, I know
that has no regard for our neighbors. But I think when you start identifying yourself as a European primarily, that's when I kind of get off.
Well, it's just that it's like, yeah, if you do identify primarily as a European, it demotes nationality. It puts it sort of at the service of something bigger than that. And it's like, well, That's not what's best for the nation ultimately, because that's still what we operate in. Certainly other European countries aren't doing that. Like I don't think the majority, say, of French people would say they think of themselves as European before. I haven't looked at a poll before this, but I'm going to assume they wouldn't think of themselves as European before they'd think of themselves as French. Certainly, to refer back to the Polish example, God knows that wouldn't be the case there. But just because I know we have a couple of other topics to cover, but some people might think we left some Helen McEntee's obvious statements sort of unaddressed, where is essentially saying we cannot see the stage to these voices, and it's like, well, who are you speaking to there? It's like if I don't know what percentage of the country might consider itself Eurosceptic, but why can't they be Eurosceptical? Why can't they be allowed to advocate for their perspective? Why can't they be allowed to um have their grievances, as it were? Like, who would be ceding the stage to these people? It's like, is this or is this not a democracy in which a range of views are allowed? I mean, as I say, I do understand sort of merits of the, because even the EU as it stands currently, there are some merits, very basic merits, you might say. Some countries have benefited. Ireland, obviously, a net contributor to the EU, as I understand it at this stage, but some countries do benefit enormously from EU funding, so good for them. But so there are some benefits from some perspectives, but that doesn't negate the fact that, as you say, you can validly criticize it and indeed want to leave it if you want to. And it's not for Helen McEntee or anyone else that you sort of might be speaking to say that we can't cede the stage to these voices. If a majority of Irish people decided that was the course they wanted to take, you'd have to respect that, and you know that's the course we'd be taking. So there is once again this kind of anti-democratic streak in the language that kind of implies that there is a right way to see the situation, and to think otherwise is to have sort of uh, stray off the path of goodness and truth, I suppose.
Well, there is only one correct take on our next topic, which is that rents in Ireland are absolutely preposterous. And I don't know if we want to spend a whole lot of time on this because everybody already knows this and it's not really a news story per se, so much as it
Mm.
is just me going on a rant, because I've been looking recently at daft.ie, and just a fun game that I've started playing is you just pick a random county. Ideally, not in Dublin, because we all know Dublin is mental, and you kind of expect to pay a bit of a premium if you're in the
Mm.
capital city. Not as much as people are forced to pay. It is way, way, way too high. But still, in all, like if you're living in the capital city, you know you're going to spend a little bit more, and that you kind of factor that into your assumptions when you're going into it. You know what you're getting in for.
Mm.
Whereas if you're trying to move to like Carlow, and there's nothing wrong with Carlow, I'm not criticizing Carlow, but you know, if you're in like a rural part of Offaly, you know you're going to have less access to certain amenities. You know, a lot of people, if they work in Dublin, that's not going to be the most convenient commute, things like that. And so
Mm.
that's obviously going to knock a good bit off the price, you assume. And so you pick a random county like Waterford or something, and then you just sort by like most expensive, or you just even just take a skim down the list. You'll like look at like average homes, and the level of madness that is out there is really something to behold, as far as crazy prices. I did a piece earlier in the week about one that was like 8 grand for a month for a semi-detached, like normal looking house. And a lot of the descriptions, if you look at them, they say that they're explicitly aiming it at corporate settings. So where the idea is that you get a lot of professionals and like the company pays for it. Like no
All
individual
right.
person could afford to pay 8 grand a month. And if you could, you'd be living in a mansion. Why would you bother renting some semi D in the middle of nowhere? So the plan is instead to rent it to a company, and if they need their team on site to access like an industrial campus or something, that they can then be put up by the employer.
Mm.
And like the problem with this is it's such an exorbitant, extortionate amount. I don't want to say extortionate because look, like nobody has to pay it if you don't want to pay
Yeah.
it, but it's such a like it's just offensive to I think most people's common sense when you look at that, and it's a real indicator, I think, of just how bad things have gotten, that is even a practice that you could try to cram five or six random
Well,
employees
that's
of a company.
an important point as well that I think was, this was the first house you did one on where, yeah, it was a regular semi-detached house, but what, it was supposed to sleep eight or something like this? Was that?
Yeah, here I'll pull it up because I've done a couple since then, so I don't want to get my facts mixed up. But yeah, it's something like that. It
And
was
I do think that there's a part of the reason this is so infuriating for so many people is because it does sort of get to deeper questions about sort of, how would you put it? I'm reluctant to say it gets to deeper questions of human dignity because I think obviously there's a long tradition in Ireland and elsewhere of many people sleeping in small spaces. Indeed, we're living only in a small apartment, and our family is growing with my wife and I and our two kids now, and it's a very small space. So I think you can obviously be just as dignified in a small space as you can be in a big house where you've each got your own room and plenty of space. But there's something about the kind of contracting material standards, I suppose. 20 years ago, I don't think there was many people expected to, cram eight of you into a semi-detached house like this, while at the same time the price is being asked for is soaring. I think there's something sort of humiliating, demeaning is maybe more so the word. I don't know whether it's because we kind of had developed this material standard or we'd kind of gotten used to this, but I do think that's the added sting in all of this for people.
Yeah, you're paying more to get considerably less.
Yeah.
And there's loads and loads of examples of this that people are seeing. And the other thing that's pretty alarming is at any given moment, if you go onto a property website, there aren't that many properties even to rent. It's not even like everything costs a fortune, but sure, look, you'll get somewhere. It's not even a guarantee that you will get somewhere. You have to fight for the opportunity to pay through the nose for some kip, basically, is the situation we're in now. And I think we're probably going to talk about it on a future podcast, the new rental rules that are
Yeah.
coming in March. We probably don't have time for that on today's podcast because it's a whole thing, but it's bad when it unites the left and the right in criticism of it, where you've got like John McGurk and Sinn Féin saying it's going to be a total disaster and screw over everybody involved, renters and landlords alike. It's like, because rent controls have been really successful, haven't they? Like they have a good track record in New York and Berlin and everywhere
Yeah.
else they've been tried. Except, of course, they haven't, and they've led to complete unmitigated catastrophe. But yeah, I don't know if I even want to. I don't really have much more even to say about that. And part of it, by the way, I have to say as well, is you just know that at least some of these properties, the idea is to pile in migrant workers who would be willing to stay in a cramped condition like that, where they're not going to complain effectively if you stick 20 guys into a house. I'm being hyperbolic there, not literally 20 guys, but you know what I mean, that
Yeah.
you can hire a load of Indian software guys. And by the way, I'm not criticizing the guys for that. It's not fair to them
Yeah.
either.
Yeah.
It's not a criticism of the workers themselves. It's just to say that this is clearly what's envisaged, at least in some cases. And so that's another component to this, which I think doesn't get discussed enough.
Well, I do think some of that particular aspects when a lot of the time when people are willing to go to a country to work, they're very kind of mission oriented and they're going in with like, okay, I'm doing this to do my job and to earn my money. In many sort of Southeast Asian cases, to send remittances back so that, their family at home can afford a better standard of living. Whereas in Ireland, you're talking about people are looking at homes. They're looking at houses for homes. They're looking at houses because that's where they want to establish their life. It's where they might want to, start a family and things like that. So it's particularly radicalizing from that perspective. Obviously, another factor that comes into this that I kind of alluded to a moment ago is that I'm going to say we're very fortunate, rather, to have grown up in the most materially comfortable time in human history. There can be no doubt about that. I just constantly find myself more aware of all of the things that are completely abnormal that we just take for granted, like on-demand hot showers, if you're lucky, abundant food. All of these things are, by no means guaranteed and certain, and there's a lot of people in the world today who don't have access to all of those things.
Sorry to interrupt you, but like when you hear Karl Marx describe what the ideal society would be if everything went to plan, if communism worked, which it obviously doesn't, but if it worked, what he would be envisaging for his utopia at the end of it if everything went according to plan. And it's like way worse than the crappiest Western country you could possibly imagine today. He was like, you're only going to have to work 80 hours a week or whatever. You'll have 2 square meals a day. Again, I'm exaggerating. That's not actually what he said. But anyway, my point is, for somebody living in the 1800s, even their wildest imagination would be like crappy substandard conditions for us. Like if you tried to inflict that on somebody, the World Health Organization would get involved and say that's like a violation of their human rights. And that was to them was like living the dream, Well, you live better than a king or an emperor throughout most of human history.
And it is like that. It's so many of us in Ireland were so fortunate to grow up in the homes that we grew up in, comfortable. We really did grow up during, there's all pros and cons to any time, anywhere. But Ireland was a great place to grow up when I was growing up, and I wouldn't have wanted it any differently. And I'm sure it's the same for many people. And I think because of that, it makes it not just in Ireland, this isn't unique to Ireland, it's the same to so much of the Western world. It makes you acutely aware of the diminishing standards because you're so used to having it so good. Which I think, as I say, makes these sort of insane offers, rental offers, and obviously purchasing offers that you're seeing on property websites all the more stark because you're people who grew up in perfectly lovely family homes, and now the best they can hope for is to rent something with 6 or 7 other people, and it's not you're paying an absolutely insane amount of your paycheck, and that's the best you can hope for at the moment. If you're going to do any better than that, you're going to have to save for 2 or 3 decades, and maybe you'll get something then. But it is a radicalizing state of affairs for many people, understandably.
Yeah, most definitely. And speaking of radical insanity, we might talk a little bit about a certain Fianna Fáil TD by the name of Nisha O'Curiel, who was talking on the AI committee that the government has been putting forward, the Oireachtas Committee on Artificial Intelligence. This was last week, and I wrote an article on this where he was asking certain state agencies like revenue and so on if they use a certain AI model that was designed by the Irish tech company Intercom. And I don't know a lot about Intercom. I don't know a lot about the people behind Intercom. I believe the CEO who's an Irishman. He created this company with a couple other people. It's a global company. They have offices in America and all over the world, and they're very successful in the kind of financial tech space. So it's sort of like an Irish business success story. Very, very significant company. And I know that the CEO, Owen McCabe, is quite critical of the government. He's critical of immigration. I believe when that woman, Irina Zarutska, was it?
That was it.
In America, yeah. When she was attacked on the bus and killed, he paid for murals of her to go up around the United States, to raise awareness about that issue. So he's kind of politically engaged in that sense. I've never spoken to him. I've never had an interaction with him, but I've seen some of his tweets, and you're tangentially aware of these people. And it turned out that Intercom, his company, does not do business with these state agencies. But we had this Fianna Fáil TD saying explicitly that the reason he does not want Irish state agencies to do business with companies like Intercom is because the CEO has quote unquote anti-government and quote unquote anti-immigration views. This was the argument he put forward for why the state should not do business with such people. And he said that he was worried that tech bros would be too politically involved and therefore they shouldn't be given government contracts. So once again, just saying the quiet part out loud that that we have at least some legislators in this country who would deny a company access to a state tender on the basis of the politics of some of its senior staff, which kind of just says it all. I don't think that needs to be added to. It kind of speaks for itself. And I was just telling you off air, Jason, that these people have successfully knocked me off the train, where a couple of weeks ago I was saying how I actually understood the argument for regulating tech to prevent young people and children from being exposed to dodgy stuff. And I said that I thought that the sacrifices from a civil liberties perspective, or the risks, were worth taking because it was such a major issue. And of course, I still think it's a major issue. And of course, I still want that to be addressed. But with all the things I've seen over the last couple of weeks, I tried to agree with them. Like, I really tried my best to see the government's perspective and not to just because something I'm very cognizant of, not to go off on a tangent, but you hear about people like PvP who just rant and rave not morning, noon, and night about everything all the time, no matter what. Like, the government can do no right. If the government isn't doing something, they're complaining. If the government is doing something, they're complaining that they didn't do enough of it and they didn't do it soon enough. And if they did do it soon and early, then they should have done it 2 years ago. And there's always a complaint. So, and when you act like that, when you're that unreasonable, people kind of just tune you out and think this person isn't worth listening to because you're just an ideologically possessed whinger, basically. So I really try my best to not be like that and to give government credit where it's due and other political parties, and, you know, to really be as fair as possible in these criticisms. And so from that perspective, I thought, yeah, you know what, child protection, you know, certain common sense regulations of the internet, I can see an argument for that. That doesn't sound so bad to me. I think that's all right. But when you hear how outrageously authoritarian these guys are, and this is just one example. We were talking before about Sinead Gibney wanting to seize tech companies and use the algorithms to push the government agendas and so on and so forth. I've just come to the conclusion once again. I've gone back the other way, where I go, nah, actually, these people can't be trusted with this kind of power at all. It needs to be done by somebody, but not by them. I'm not comfortable with it while they're in charge, frankly.
What I had the quotes here from that TD, but I didn't take down his name. That Fianna Fáil TD who made the suggestion about the not essentially doing business with companies with CEOs that had sort of anti-government stances. But like that whole meeting, because it was at an Oireachtas committee, wasn't it, that he was speaking? Yeah, he was at an Oireachtas committee, and you know, there were a whole load of crazy exchanges there where he was asking about that, and then this is from your article on the topic, asked how state agencies would approach the issue of political views of potential vendors. Ruth Kennedy of the Revenue Commission said the political association was not taken into account during tender process. I mean, as you said, talk about saying the quiet part out loud. Since when were state agencies supposed to be approaching the issue of political views of potential vendors? I do feel that, you know, we're obviously so awash in American headlines, and it's understandable why we speak about that. America obviously matters, and what happens there has many effects everywhere else. But I do feel as though, because everyone's looking at what's going on with, whatever your thoughts on it happen to be, everyone's looking at what's going on with ICE and the sort of counter movement against ICE. And they're all talking about how totalitarian America is becoming as a result of all of this. You're missing these completely totalitarian tendencies at home, where these are now 2 consecutive weeks really insane things TDs have said and suggested. Sinead Gibney, as you said, Sinead Gibney's comments in relation to tech companies last week. What was it? She said that they should be nationalised. That was what she said on that occasion. And yes,
Yeah.
also that suggestion that government should use the algorithm to essentially promote what they want people to see. And now you've got this suggestion, obviously, this week that the state should avoid doing business essentially with companies headed by people who disagree with the government or express views that the government finds to be unpalatable. So the word is constantly overused, but it's not being it's not being misused here. These are totalitarian expressions, and I think it's extraordinarily telling that people don't mind saying these things on a public platform in meetings where these are recorded and people can go back and look at them. Presumably don't mind saying them because number one, they don't experience any pushback on this, and number two, because it's not considered to be outrageous in these circles anyway. It's kind of I can only imagine I can only imagine what the sort of off the record conversations are like in all too many government departments and state agencies. If these are the kind of utterances that we have access to, I think that this is it's really disturbing to me actually. And I do think just another point I would make in relation to this is that I am constant. It kind of ties into that some of those polling results over the weekend. It was the Business Post, I think, had commissioned a Red Sea poll. Oh, I didn't pull the numbers up before this. It's only coming to me as we were speaking about it, where they essentially it was something like over 60% of people thought X should be banned in Ireland when the Irish public was polled, whereas 20% or something like that said no, leave it as it is. I'm obviously of the opinion that the vast majority of people have no idea what they're even annoyed at X about. They just see loads of headlines and articles that do essentially amount to misinformation. I mean, you and I spoke about it on a podcast recently about the actual failings of Grok, and because I stand by, I think Grok can be misused and was being misused. I don't know what people were talking about saying they couldn't see any of these things. You literally, a woman would put up a picture of herself, and you just went into the comments and people were like, Grok poster in bikini, Grok poster in bikini, and things like that. And I do think that's a genuine misuse, and I stand by it. I don't think Grok should be able to do that. But it's more from there into people talking about how Grok is producing um, uh, essentially whatever pornography you might like, the way sort of child sexual abuse imagery is rampant on the platform and things like that. And none of that, to my knowledge, is true. It's kind of morphed into this ridiculous, which it was always going to take on this shape. People were never going to stick to the facts of the case. They were always going to take it and run. And I essentially made that case in an article I wrote initially, which was like, Elon should be very quick to curtail Grok because governments were going to take it and run with that. They were going to go as far as they could. And that's what you're seeing in Ireland, where you now have there's been so much media coverage, kind of crazy media coverage of this over the past couple of weeks, that you now have something like over 60% of respondents saying in a poll that X should be banned. It's an inescapable conclusion that a lot of people don't like in Ireland, that the public is not where the politically dissatisfied would like it to be. To put it that way, politically dissatisfied is too broad because there's a lot of politically dissatisfied, just to use the term, leftists in Ireland who don't think Ireland is sort of left enough. Whereas, I mean, more so people who, have a bit of common sense, to put it that way, and are very dissatisfied with the way we've been governed in the country. And I think a lot of the time, okay, there's broad consensus on the immigration situation being out of hand, but I think sort of general sentiment is a lot more controlled in Ireland and a lot more liberal than I think people would like it to be or expect it to be. Results like this only sort of, again, I don't doubt a lot of the people who were responding to that poll had no idea what's going on X or what Grok can do. But I think that's only more testament to the fact that they've just seen bad headlines and they're like, oh, okay, Grok bad, Elon Musk bad, we should ban it.
Yeah.
And I think to tie this back into what we were talking about, I think that's fertile grounds for like mad suggestions like those made by Sinead Gibney and, as I said, this TD that I didn't take his name down, this Fianna Fáil
Yeah,
TD.
it kind of gives them permission, they feel, to go for a mask off moment and just start
100%.
dropping bombs. That they don't have to be careful. I
Yeah.
think after the hate speech bill and the hiding they got on that, they kind of were careful and they laid low for a little while, and now they're getting a little bit of a second wind when it comes to this stuff.
I can do
Um,
a clean segue to our next topic in relation to this, because you might ask, how is it possible to reach such a culturally confused moment? And I would, part of that answer, anyway, there's a lot of answers to that, but part of that answer anyway is mass media, which we referenced, in relation to these news reports about Grok and Elon Musk that I would say were highly misleading. But it's also through movies and things like that. And so the last topic we wanted to discuss today was, I you can correct me if I'm wrong here. Would I be more the movie, but I'm not claiming at all to be an expert. I just really love movies. I go into the cinema as one of the things that I really enjoy. Even we have very young kids, and my wife gets some time to do her things, but oftentimes when I get a little bit of free time, I like to go to the cinema. And so this segment might be slightly of more interest to me than you. Would that be fair?
no, I love movies. I'm a movie guy too, so we
Oh,
can
very good.
again go band for band on the
Okay.
film.
Well, the points that I wanted to make then were that the Oscar nominations were announced last week, and obviously way more awards than we're going to be bothered to get into. But one that really struck me, so much so that I wrote an article about it today, was the sort of historic development that a movie smashed the Oscar nominations records last week. So prior to this point, the movies that had received the most Oscar nominations ever in history, there was three of them, tied on 14.
Let me guess. Morbius.
Oh gosh.
Um, the Last Airbender, and I'm gonna say the what's that film? Oh, the one, not the Minecraft movie, but it's kind of like that. Yeah, I'll go with the Minecraft movie. That's
The
gonna be my three
Minecraft
guesses.
movie.
Final answer.
Well, I would actually prefer any of those to the one that did get the most nominations. So just to tee it up, previously tied on the highest number of Oscar nominations received for a single movie. There's three movies, each of which received 14 nominations. Those were All About Eve, which I haven't seen, Titanic, which obviously everyone's seen, and La La Land, which I saw and I liked. I'm not a big musical guy, but I could at least understand it was a very quality production. I can at least understand why, the Academy thought, okay, we'll give this a ton of nominations. All of those were surpassed, obviously. And I only watched Titanic again recently. There's a lot you can laugh about in that film. It's really cheesy at points, and my wife and I were laughing at it. But it is a monumental film. Like there's no, it's obvious why it was such a cinematic experience and why it received 14 nominations, which only makes it all the more farcical that Sinners by Ryan Coogler received 16 nominations. I don't know how many of our listeners will have seen this, because it was much bigger in the US than it was in Ireland, but I think it's still worth discussing because this is mass media. This is the culture everyone's immersed in, and it's what people are interacting with. I watched Sinners last October, and to say I was underwhelmed would be an understatement. A friend and I were both fans of horror movies, and it's billed as a horror, so we thought, okay, this might be enjoyable. And we were genuinely struggling to keep our eyes open about an hour into it. It's a southern gothic horror, so it's set in Mississippi, and I'm not sure what year, but during the sort of racist days, anyway. And it
2014.
2014 exactly. We're at now, if you're to believe the sort of popular media. But it's about twin brothers who had gone up to Chicago, and coming back they decide to open what's known as a juke joint, which is essentially a place they can all drink and have drink and play music and things like that. And it sort of blends all this interesting blues music with vampires. That's where the horror element comes in. But I had a look earlier. It takes 40 minutes for the first vampire to make his appearance in the movie, and then it takes another 20, 25, 30 minutes for any of the sort of action to even begin. And even when the action does begin, it's very stop-starty, and there's a lot of unnecessary conversation that if you're not interested in the sort of American Deep South, if you're not interested in blues music culture, you're going to kind of be like, which is exactly what
It
your
does
wife.
it does a flashback the vampire appears, and you're like, oh, thank goodness, like this is gonna get exciting. And then it does a flashback to the vampire's childhood and how he became a vampire, starting from when he was like a toddler, and then like showing him going to school and everything, and they have to build.
Well, like, yeah, well, it was essentially that boring. I mean, as I say, the worst thing I can say about it is that we were genuinely falling asleep. It was, just to say straight off the bat, it wasn't scary at all in the slightest. It was,
Dracula doing his taxes and like
yeah.
you
Well, I
know.
would have preferred it because at least would have been kind of traditional. But this was really boring. There was a thing I didn't even mention in the article because I was sort of on such a rant about the poor quality of the film, but it's obviously of Irish interest. The main vampire in it is, I can't remember whether he's directly Irish or he's of Irish descent. And they really kind of lean into that, where there's this really weird scene in it that everyone was like, "Oh, it's brilliant," and I've no, honest to God, I've no idea why, because it had nothing to do with the plot. Or it had nothing obviously to do with the plot. Where this vampire and this sort of band he builds up around himself are all dancing out in the dark, and they're dancing to the Rocky Road to Dublin. And I don't know. I feel like the director was just like, "Oh, that's a kind of traditional Irish ballad. We'll put that in there as a kind of nod to authentic Irish culture or something like this." But the messaging was all over the place. Where this Irish, so the vampires were kind of supposed to be a symbol for the way in which white people kind of leech the life out of black communities and black culture. But the main vampire, the main villain in it, is, as I say, is either Irish or of Irish descent. And it's like, if you wanted to represent that, that's the worst possible group you could have chosen, given that Irish immigrants initially did not fare very well over in America in the slightest. And indeed, our own domestic history is absolutely horrendous to us. So that made no sense, first of all. But then, as I say, it received 16 Oscar nominations. And as I outlined in this piece, I'm not going to say I can't help but feel it is the case that this is certainly for political reasons. Like, a couple of years back, 2019, Black Panther received 7 Oscar nominations, which is a joke because it was a completely forgettable Marvel movie like the rest of the Marvel movies. There are Marvel movies that, on all of the metrics you might care about, like cultural impact, revenue, technical performance, did much better than Black Panther. Like, I don't like Marvel particularly much, but I can appreciate that Avengers Infinity War and Endgame were massive cultural moments that a lot of people cared about, and they were quite unprecedented in terms of tying so many movies together. Both of them only got 1 Oscar nomination each, and they were for just some purely technical category. Whereas Black Panther, which incidentally was directed by the same guys direct Sinners, Ryan Coogler, got 7 Oscar nominations, one of which was for Best Picture. So like it's just like I can see you get it as I'm saying it. It's a joke, and it's the same thing with this Sinners. Like, I'm not going to say it was a bad movie. I'm just going to say it was a fine movie. But the idea that it's worth 16 Oscar nominations is a joke. And I'll let you in just in a second. But another thing I wanted to add was that another movie that got nearly also surpassed the all time number of Oscar nominations was One Battle After Another, which came out late last summer, I think, last September. So I went to see that one in the cinema as well. And I'm actually going to say that was a pretty good movie. I'll say that. I thought it was really well made. It was quite entertaining. But the morals and the messaging in it were horrendous. And I wrote an article about that at the time as well, because I like writing about movies, and John is very good for indulging me in that. And I essentially said that, like, it's a fine movie if you just inhabit the movie's world and kind of enjoy it and enjoy the story. It's very tense. It's very kind of thrilling. It's well made. The cinematography was great. All of that, technically really good. But then you zoom out and you look at the critical reaction, where people actually received it as a kind of rallying cry for the cultural moment America was in. They were like, you got all these kind of liberal reviewers who were, and it wasn't just this way, it was received this way in Europe as well, because obviously everyone looking at the threat of the Trump administration and resurgent nationalism and right-wing sentiment. And they were saying, oh, this movie is a rallying. It was literally described that way by the New York Times reviewer, as a rallying cry. And people saying that it was a hopeful movie amidst these dark days. What the movie is about this. I have the phrase here because it was quite specific. It's a fictitious far left revolutionary group, French 75, which was somewhat modeled on the actual militant Marxist organization of the 70s, the Weather Underground. and it
Mm.
follows them as they engage in a campaign of sabotaging the power grid, bombing pro-life politicians' offices, robbing banks and things like this. And then I don't want to spoil too much, but anyway, one of the characters involved in that, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, they all have to go underground because they're rumbled by this racist white supremacist. And in the movie, he is actually a racist white supremacist, but it's obviously sort of being portrayed as like this is what all the authorities are like. Immigration colonel. And the movie becomes a kind of, it's supposed to be a kind of heartwarming father daughter story trying to resist oppression and political oppression and things like that. But you can never get away from the fact that the main character is involved in bombing pro-life politicians' offices, conducting sabotage, robbing banks, and things like this. And as I pointed, all of the sort of characters who were portrayed as virtuous in the movie were uh, illegal immigrants to America. All of the white characters in it nearly were portrayed as either being allies to those immigrants, or they were portrayed as being sort of racist and on the side of the authorities and against all of this. As I said, the morals and the messaging of the movie were genuinely horrendous, and anyone who sort of made that point was sort of criticized as being a party pooper, being a sort of stuffy conservative who couldn't, appreciate good art if it slapped them in the face. But I thought it was very telling as well that received 13 Oscar nominations, because while being a good movie, I just feel this was a very political Oscars season, and it was very evident in the choices the Academy made.
Yeah, I think it's all extremely political, and you get a lot of not even, some of it is like, I do think there is kind of a sinister agenda there where they're trying to push values and influence society in their own image in a way that is corrosive and harmful, race grievance stuff, and various other social issues that you can name. But I think some of it is also just these people being such pseudo intellectual fart sniffers that just they want something with a message. Like, I don't want something with a message. I don't want something with a right wing or a left wing message really at all. Like, I don't really like this thing that some like right wingers do, where, like, take music for example. They go, okay, the music industry is saturated with like left wing garbage, so I'm gonna make right wing music to try and counteract that. And I'm like, no, just make good music.
Yeah,
Don't
yeah.
be doing this stuff. Like, you can be, and the same goes for movies, and the same goes for television, and so on. I feel like audiences are kind of just getting sick of having stuff forced on them in general, regardless of what the perspective is. Like, there's this movie studio that I might have mentioned before, A24, that people will probably be
Oh
familiar with.
yeah, huge fan.
Uh, Yeah, and like, what I like about them, for those who don't know or who aren't maybe familiar, they're the ones who did a film which regular listeners of this podcast will remember. I mentioned that movie Civil War, which
Mm.
is like a hypothetical drama about what would happen if there was a modern American Civil War where certain states were trying to overthrow the president and he was acting like a dictator and so on. And it's very like neutral. I went into it thinking it was going to piss me off because I'm a conservative and I thought this is going to be like a thinly veiled analogy for Trump or something, and it wasn't at all. It was very fair. But anyway, regardless, they do cool movies that are just like kind of interesting, where you're like,
Yeah.
oh wow, I've never seen that before, or I've never thought of that. Like, I don't know if you've seen the movie that came out just last year by them, Warfare. Have you come across that? Or
I've seen it.
uh,
I haven't watched the movie, but I've seen it on like streaming services and things.
yeah, I thought it was really good. And Megan also, my wife also thought it was good, and she is not usually into like war films or things like that. That kind of stresses her out. But it was, with this isn't a spoiler. It's not like, it's a true story, and it's basically a bunch of U.S. Navy SEALs in Iraq during the Iraq War in like 2006 or something, and they're in a building, and I'm pretty sure this is even in the trailer, so this isn't like a spoiler really. Long story short, their air support gets cut off, so the building's kind of being besieged, and they can't get evacuated quickly, so they're kind of having to fight off, but they're in a bad position. And this really happened. This is like a true story. But what I liked about it, and I'm building to a point here, this isn't just me ranting about some random film. The That what I really liked about it is that it deals with the very mundane things in warfare that you don't really think about. Like, for example, there's somebody who's injured and they have him like in the building and he's like a casualty, but he's not dead. And he's screaming his head off because he's in excruciating pain. So, and there's no music either. It's not like
Mm.
um so it's not scary per se. It's not like haunting or something. But when you think of going to war, you think of, oh yeah, people are going to be shooting at me. There's going to be bombs going off. You think of the big stuff. You don't think about the little stuff like I'm trying to concentrate and there's a guy screaming behind me and he won't shut up. You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah. You have to get one of the
Or like
boys
the
put his
smell.
hand over his mouth or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like the smell, or like a guy goes to put he goes to put morphine. He's going to inject a morphine pen into an injured guy, but because he kind of panics or he's like not he's like scatterbrained because they've just been in like a massive gun battle and he's not thinking clearly. He accidentally holds it upside down and he pricks his own finger. And apparently
Oh
that really happened.
gosh.
Like this is again, it's a true story. So then he's kind of like out of it and he's all loopy and they're kind of relying on him to do stuff, but he's high on morphine. You know,
Yeah,
like these
yeah.
are the things that you don't think about, like the little logistical things that are very like
But it's
plausible
like
that
that.
you can imagine
It's like an
happening.
experience that you can enter into, and it's not like obviously, any movie you can subject to a critical analysis. You can look at that and say, well, what does this movie have to say about the American invasion of Iraq and things like that? But it's also the case that you can watch it and experience a good movie and a good bit of storytelling. Uh,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It makes you kind of think about stuff that like afterwards you're like, wow, I never considered X, Y, and Z, or imagine being in that situation. Like if I had to go to war,
yeah,
you don't think about your boots getting wet and now you have like wet feet as you're marching, like stupid
yeah.
little stuff like that. Anyway, but
Whereas like,
my point is the only point I'm making is I like movie studios that do cool things like that do not, it's not just remakes of remakes of remakes of stupid slop that they're just churning out to try, like the Emoji Movie or whatever, where they're just trying to make as much money as possible, where they're actual creative people who are like, let's do something cool. And even if it doesn't, I mean, they are very successful. Like these movies do make money, but you get the impression that they kind of don't care if it's
yeah,
like for a niche audience. They're not too bothered about the money to a certain extent. They're
yeah.
kind of like, let's just do something cool because it's a good idea for a film.
That's a good description of A24, and you've made me want to watch that movie. But one movie, so that was kind of somewhat apolitical one. One movie, and it kind of ties to what I was talking about. Obvious, I said before, and people might have been like, "Oh, Oscars political, the sky is blue," this kind of thing. But one thing that I thought was very funny was that so the best movie I saw last year, best movie I saw in the cinema, I don't know. I think it was the best movie I saw last year. Certainly the one I thought most about and that I enjoyed the most was one called Eddington. I mentioned it on one of the live streams that we're doing now on Wednesday evenings in relation to a story we were talking about. But that movie was nowhere. That's why a very acclaimed director, Ari Aster, who I think previously has done some A24 movies, and they obviously Eddington was nowhere near the Oscar season, and the reason for that is number one, it was an intensely topical movie. It was set in 2020, May 2020, in a small town called Eddington in New Mexico. And it's literally about the outbreak of the COVID pandemic and how this town is dealing with it, and how that blends then with the Black Lives Matter stuff when those protests come and hit the town. And Ari Aster is not some, as far as I'm aware, not some sort of right winger. He's not particularly conservative. I mean, he moves in the sort of Hollywood circles and writing and things. But the movie, from my perspective, was absolutely searing of a lot of the sort of dominant thought patterns of sort of liberals of the day. And this applies on both sides of the Atlantic, which is very, because I know I said it earlier, we're way too America brained for the most part in Ireland and in Europe more generally, but there are some of it is worth talking about and analyzing, and some of it is unavoidable in terms of talking about and analyzing, because like that, those 2020 Black Lives Matter protests came to Ireland, and they were one of the few things that were exempted from the COVID rules, as was the case nearly everywhere else. And anyway, this movie was like it was really funny in different different parts, and part of that was because of how like one of the protagonists, for example, just can't stand the COVID rules, but there's this kind of really trendy mayor of the town who's constantly enforcing them. And he kind of comes across as a liberal and someone who tries to paint himself as caring about everyone and caring about this and caring about that, but he's actually quite a nasty person. And it was a really funny movie. It was really it captured the like insanely feverish atmosphere of 2020 and indeed of like present politics and life in a way that I've never experienced in a movie before. I'm not just going to rant about this movie, but one thing it did crazy well that I haven't seen anywhere else was the presence of phones and the internet in the movie. People were on their phones a lot in the movie, and the camera would often focus in on the phone screen, and there'd be people just like looking at these things, and you knew they were looking at news on their phones, and then they would sort of be radicalized by it and things like that. In both directions. In this movie, actually, they were mostly being radicalized in the sort of left wing direction in different ways. But there's a lot more going on with that movie that I won't rant about. But I thought that was a really good movie. That was my favorite movie of last year, and a lot of people really liked it as well. But in the sort of critically acclaimed circles that reviewed one battle after another and Sinners very well for the most part, this movie was universally kind of, if not trashed, it was sort of written off as being too obscure to understand or not really worth your time. And it's just very clear that, again, to refer back to the point we started with at the beginning about mass media being being sort of indoctrinating ultimately into a particular viewpoint, all all of the institutions that support the movies, a lot of the people behind the movies themselves and things like that, it's all one direction for a lot of these people, and that's just progressive liberalism. And it's no wonder that being the case then when you've got movies like Sinners getting like smashing the records for Oscar nominations. No wonder people just sort of unthinkingly fall um into sort of mainstream think, I suppose, to put it that way.
Yeah, most definitely. And with that, we will leave our viewers with an extraordinarily long
Yeah, it
episode of the
is.
Long
Yeah.
Game podcast. But I don't mind. We want to talk about films that we like. It's culturally relevant. So if anybody has a problem with that, you can shut up. You don't have to watch the full
Or
thing.
even better, you can tell us to shut up in the comments and just engage with it. That's always good for us.
Yeah, absolutely. You can leave all your insults for Jason. Flood the zone with criticisms. No,
Jeez.
with that said, we hope you all enjoyed another episode of a Long Game podcast, and we will catch you all next week. God bless.
God bless.